Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to episode 51 of the Brave New Weed podcast, conversations for the post-prohibition era. Thanks again for joining us, and I want to say hello to you again, Matthew Hendershot.
Hello, Joe. Wonderful to be back on the show, back in action over here. It was a nice little break we had as we followed you along your romp through Denver, Colorado there.
And now you're following me vaguely through my romp through California, which has been pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to you about that in 1 second. I want to first thank the sponsor of this show, which is Atlas Growers. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. You know, Atlas is based in Edmonton, Canada. That is way up there in Alberta, sort of north of Montana, in case you don't know. And they are soon to be the largest producer of medical cannabis in the country of Canada. They have a pharmaceutically viable cannabis flower and a cannabis product, and they are all cultivated in a state-of-the-art, get this, 38,000 square foot controlled environment facility. That's a big facility. The team is committed to improving lives by really creating the world's most trusted cannabis product. That's a high ambition, which is great. And for Atlas, which I love, it all starts with education. They're dedicated to teaching all Canadians about the qualities, the types, and the uses of cannabis. And this is a big mission. It's no less than to rewrite the book on the historically misunderstood plant. Along the way, they aim to aid all Canadian patients to make smart and informed decisions and to use cannabis in a safe, effective way. You can learn more about Atlas at atlasgrowers.com, or you can follow them on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Atlas Growers. This episode of the Brave New Weed podcast features somebody I've been wanting to speak to for a long time. His name is Kris Krane. Kris has made the interesting transition from advocate to owner of a multistate operator dispensary company. And that's a very interesting transition, which he is very frank and very honest. So I can hardly wait to get him on. But before I do that, I want to talk about a few things. First in the news, and then about what life is like in California. Actually, let me talk about what life is like in California first, Matthew. I feel like when I come here, I enter a different country. The other night, I went to a seminar led by a bunch of women about using cannabis as an aphrodisiac. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they spoke about was using cannabis as relief for the puffy taco. And I was scratching my head for the longest time. Do you know what a puffy taco is?
I'm afraid I might, yeah.
Okay. I think, once you think about it, it's obviously an inflamed vagina from having too much sex. But, that's what I love about California. They're dealing with issues of puffy taco-ness, whereas, other states are still dealing with, should this be legal or is this dangerous?
Yeah.
And it's just such a breath of fresh air, and it shows you how all of this just feels so normal. It was in a private club. It was an audience of about 200 people, super engaged, all different types. Again, men, women, gay, straight, old, young, some with great stories to share, others with many questions they wanted to know the answers to. So we're going to have one of the women eventually on the show who makes cannabis products specifically for women. It's very interesting. Another great product I tried is called High Hops. I'm going to nominate this as my favorite cannabis product of the year. Listen to this. This is a collaboration between two companies, Lagunitas, who makes Lagunitas beer, right? IPA.
Oh yeah, okay,
right?
Yeah.
And
right.
Cannacraft, who we've had the president of Cannacraft and the founder on the podcast a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And they produce excellent oils and edible products. Anyway, what they've done is they've merged and they've created a hops-infused, cannabis-infused water, sparkling water.
Sparkling water.
Yeah, and it tastes like, do you remember Fresca?
Yeah, of course.
Do you remember how Fresca was sort of gross but sort of good? It had the right idea of grapefruitiness.
Yeah,
hops actually tastes a lot like grapefruit. And it's a very mild tasting thing, sort of like the best of Fresca. It's not sweet. It's not sweet at all, but it's very gentle, very easy. You can mix it with tequila, which I tried, which was very nice, and it's basically beer without the bloat.
I mean, is it an alcoholic product?
No, not at all.
It's not. It's just a flavored
it's a
cannabis product.
Yes, but it merges this idea of hops and cannabis, which, by the way, are biological sisters, right?
They're cousins, right?
They're cousins. Yeah, they've been separated at birth for a long time, and now this is a beautiful reunification, I think, of these blood plants, and they go very nicely together. And many people were walking around saying, "Oh, I really like this. There's no bloat. There's no bloat." And I'm thinking, if they don't advertise this as beer without the bloat, they're really missing an opportunity. But that's another reason to sort of see just how California is so much more advanced in terms of the products they're offering. My final interesting product. We've had the founder of Mellows on the show a couple of months ago also, but Mellows are these delicious marshmallows. I don't even like marshmallows, okay?
I saw
but these are marshmallows in the flavor. The one I had was brown butter and sage, and it was delicious. It is like the best dessert you can ever have. It's only 5 milligrams THC, so very low dose. Very modest, very easy to take, very satisfying, and a lovely effect.
Yeah.
They're now trying to make, I love this, mini Mellows in 1 milligram doses, so you can add them to your hot chocolate.
I love it. This is something that, I mean, you and I have spoken for a long time about the sort of bane of the edible market, which is the potency issue.
Yes.
And having something like a small bag of marshmallows that you can eat the whole bag and you're still only consuming, maximum 10 or 15 milligrams of cannabis, of THC in that, that's the kind of sweet spot, right? Because then you get that great snack as well. So you get your sweet tooth fix and you get your cannabis dose at the same time without like completely freaking out because you ate too big of a piece of chocolate, right?
Yeah, but what I loved about it was actually the flavor. The flavor of this brown butter sage product was so satisfying. It had, I don't know if umami is the right word, but it was sweet, it was savory, it was very sweet. It was full, it was unctuous. It felt delicious in the mouth, which is very rare that you get to that level. So I have to thank the makers. Oh, and also, by the way, they come in gift boxes.
Yeah,
so, I gave one to a housewarming at a housewarming party the other day, and it was the best gift you could give.
It all just speaks to this greater trend of normalization, like what you said before. If you strip away the illegality of it all to where it's no longer taboo, right? And this speaks true of like, even the sexual discussion you had before. We have, as a society, put up this taboo in America around sex in general. We're really bad about talking about sex with one another. And that's starting to change. And we've seen that happen in the past, decade to 2 decades, this real big awareness from that part. And now it seems to be happening as we're stripping away the prohibition of cannabis as well, because now we're able to just openly talk about it. And now we're able to do things like innovate on products and be creative and really challenge the boundaries of quality as well, just because it's a part of the conversation. So I think, we're just going to see more and more of this stuff, and it's going to get more nuance and more niche and more widespread as the legalization wave just continues until it's just a normal thing again.
So that leads me, I want to, rather than talk about the news this week, because I think you and I both agree that right now things sort of feel like we're in a little bit of a repetitive cycle, like this state is legalizing, that state isn't legalizing, this state is doing this, that state isn't doing that. I want to talk about something that I've been noticing, which is, and we've talked about this a bit as well, but I want to go a little deeper, which is, when you read articles these days, it seems that we are in the last gasp of prohibition. I'm reading more and more articles talking about the dangers of cannabis, this psychotic and violence, all this sort of crazy prohibitionist rhetoric coming up. And this struck me the other day, and I'm wondering what you think about it. I was reading a piece, again, in the New York Times, which seems to be backpedaling on cannabis these days. I don't understand it. There was a piece about why New Jersey's legalization effort failed. And within the piece was a paragraph that really disturbed me. It said, we talked about the dangers that were happening in Colorado and all the risks, the uptick in emergency room visits, the higher incidences of DUI, and what a disaster Colorado is. And I wanted to call that reporter and say, you really have your head up your ass. You don't know what you're talking about. Have you been to Colorado? Have you read that the former governor, John Hickenlooper, is now pro-cannabis legalization because it's done so much for the state? I mean, we just spent we just spent a few days there broadcasting. And yes, it makes sense that, of course, emergency room visits are going to go up when you suddenly legalize a product. But it's not saying that there are deaths from cannabis. It's not saying that there is increased levels of violence or schizophrenia. And it just blows me away that we keep seeing these little bits coming in. And it feels very old to me. It feels very, very old and prohibitionist. What do you think?
I get what you're going for here, Joe, and I think you're probably right in a way. I think also there's a big part of the reason why, for instance, this psychosis article has made the rounds now what feels like 2 or 3 times is because it's kind of the only thing that the opposition has to talk about.
Yeah.
They have to focus in on this thing because it's the last vestige, right? Like if we can hold on to this for a while, we can hold out longer. And the other thing that annoys me with kind of the examples that you brought up are how quickly everyone is able to blur the lines between causality and correlation when it comes to things like, oh, there's more emergency room visits from people who are panicking on a cannabis, maybe cannabinoid hypermesis syndrome situation. But it discounts and doesn't look at all the fact that, like, okay, we can also show that, like, violent crime has gone down. And that's also related. So we're not weighing necessarily benefits that we're seeing against, downfalls. So one of the arguments was you brought up the traffic accidents and, like,
DUI.
So, but DUI from alcohol is down in Colorado. So we can show statistical relationships between the legalization of cannabis and the decrease in the consumption of alcohol and alcohol-related fatalities and alcohol-related crashes on the highways. But we ignore that benefit in the press so that we can only focus on the things that suit our story. And they talked about, I think the fatalities crash statistic from the article that came out earlier this year was like, oh, it's a double-digit percentage increase in fatalities that were related to cannabis while driving behind the wheel. And it went from 9 people to 11 people. Or some
wasn't quite that small, but
statistic.
it was a micro increment, yeah.
So they had to use the percentage to make it sound scary enough, right? Because and I don't think it was 9. I think it was 90 something. Which, any loss of life is a tragedy, but they didn't comment. It wasn't loss of life. Article.
Yeah.
They didn't comment at all in the article about how drunk driving fatalities are down by a greater number.
Yeah.
Right?
Look, I was thinking, what is the historical antecedent of this? What's the closest thing we have? And it seemed to me, I was thinking about it, and it seemed to me that the closest thing was gay marriage. And when gay marriage was up in front of the Supreme Court, you were seeing, a flash of, oh my God, this is going to ruin traditional marriage for heterosexuals.
Oh, yeah, come on. People are going to marry dogs.
See a lot of pictures of men with babies in leather, right? I mean, the media and I hate to blame the media as a member of the media, but they sort of, it's almost like they get scared and they have to jump back. It's a very interesting dilemma, and I just want to caution everybody and say, like, you'll be reading these things. We're all going to be reading these things, but let's keep it in perspective, folks.
Well, and follow the money. You know, when it comes to the media, I don't have any problem at all bashing the media, a world that we are in a way a part of, because we're not beholden to the purse strings, right?
Yeah.
Nobody can come along to us and say, oh, you have to put this product in a good light, or you have to put this company in a good light. If we think they're doing poor things, we're gonna say that. But if you're a major advertised backed publication and that big whale of an advertiser comes along to you and says, listen, if you run that story that way, I'm going to pull my advertising. Now all of a sudden you're not, free to speak your own mind, right?
So that brings me to a plug I'm going to say before we get into the main segment of the main interview with Kris Krane. I want to remind all of you listeners, please, if you have a few extra pennies a month, if you have a few extra dollars a month, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It does help to ensure the veracity and the sort of standards that we've set for this podcast. Yes, we do now accept sponsors from companies that we vet and that we like and that we know are bringing good products into the world. But we really still depend on your support. So please consider going to patreon.com and if you have some extra pennies, throw a few our way. Also, I do want to remind you to join our mailing list. If you're hearing this and you do not get the podcast delivered directly to your inbox, please consider joining. It's very easy to do. You can sign up on the blog or you can sign up on bravenewweed.com. And please also, this is a new one, please consider sharing this with just one person you like, one person that you think might find value in this level of cannabis conversation. It means a lot to us. It helps spread the word, obviously, but it's also a really great way of letting people know that there are other conversations going on that are not happening in the mainstream media.
You can like and follow the Brave New Weed podcast on all the best social media platforms. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed or on Twitter @bravenewweed or Instagram @bravenewweed.
Just after Matthew and I recorded the intro to this show, an interesting article came out on Leafly trying to explain what happened in New York State where the bill failed last week. This is very interesting to us. Obviously, we live in New York, and this is a state in dire need of revenue, And cannabis is a great opportunity for that to happen. It's also a state where there's a lot of farmers, a lot of rural people who could really stand to benefit from the growing and the manufacture of cannabis products. Leafly did a great job looking at some of the reasons the bill failed and why New York State will remain the largest black market for cannabis in the country still. With us now is Bruce Barcott, editor at Leafly, leafly.com. Hi, Bruce. Thanks for joining.
Sure, no problem.
Very interested to read the piece you guys wrote on why legalization in New York failed. I feel this is important not only because I'm a New York resident, but because it is the largest state on the East Coast, and it really drives so much of what happens there. And it is a state of 20 million people. So let's talk about what your reporting showed, and I'll talk to you about what a few lobbyist friends of mine had to say as well on this topic. What do you think the big takeaways were? How would you describe why the effort failed based on the reporting?
I think it failed because of a number of reasons. I'll give you the short reasons first, and then my big takeaway reason at the end. The short reasons included everything from squabbling over taxes and the tax rate to upstate counties and municipalities growing fearful and announcing sort of preemptively that they were going to opt out no matter what the state did if it legalized. You had folks arguing over all sorts of issues. You had a number of legislators who were sort of leaning toward legalization initially, then getting cold feet, in part because of folks in the law enforcement community pushing back against legalization. But for me, one of the biggest takeaways was that the cannabis industry itself stumbled and to use a different metaphor, shot itself in the foot kind of in trying to pass this thing, because essentially, look, one of the major issues involved in passing legalization in the state of New York for the people who had the power to pass it was social equity. In other words, making sure that the people who were most harmed by the war on drugs had a fair shot at entering this legal market.
Fair enough.
Essentially, that did not happen. I mean, we started back in December writing articles here at Leafly that essentially said, look, legalization is coming. Governor Cuomo is actually behind it, pushed by, thank you, Cynthia Nixon in 2018. So he's backing it. It's in his budget. It's really actually going to happen. And people got very excited. Along the way, some folks in the cannabis industry got a little too excited and essentially started, I think at one point we saw them writing a memo where the largest existing medical marijuana companies sort of put forth their own proposal that had things like no home grow allowed.
Yes,
and,
I saw that.
Suggestions that, well, perhaps the existing medical marijuana companies would get the first licenses so that the double market, medical and adult use, would be streamlined and you'd have stores opening from day one. And they sort of seemed to backburner social equity issues. And in the end, that's what kind of killed this thing. Even the people who were really pushing for legalization, they had, very little in terms of social equity. And it was just like, well, why bother? We're not going to throw this away. We would rather wait and legalize another year rather than push this thing through without some of the measures we really have to have.
Would you say that it was an issue of corporate greed and corporate wanting to accumulate everything?
Yeah, I mean, it was an issue of corporate. I don't know if I'd put it greed, but corporate short-sightedness. In other words, I think that too often we see in the cannabis industry folks coming in now who are less familiar with a lot of the struggle that has gone on in years and decades prior to get to where we are. And look, I acknowledge that I'm in essence a carpetbagger myself. I came to this space 5 years ago when it was much less risky for me to put my neck out, and there were many who put their neck out before me, went to jail, suffered for it. Full respect to them. And you've got to know that coming in. So when you come in and you're all about just about the money and market share, you don't really know what you're stepping into, and you're apt to step on a lot of toes. And I think that's what happened here. I mean, my colleague Ben Adlin a couple of days ago compared this to the infamous Ohio debacle, where a few years ago, about 10 folks decided they'd gin up their own initiative in the state of Ohio that had them legalizing, but then owning the market, right? Basically monopolizing.
Yes.
And I mean, insults don't come much meaner than comparing something to the Ohio debacle, right?
Yes.
Anyway, so yeah, that was part of what was going on here.
Other folks who are in Albany and connected to it said that the other problem is that a lot of we now have a Democratic state assembly, which is a rarity in New York, but that a lot of the Democrats that were elected are still very much in purple zones at best. Just because they were elected doesn't mean the whole county goes blue, and that there was still a lot of opposition from some of the rural counties. Of course, the ones that I would think tend to benefit most from the opportunity to grow and manufacture. Any indication?
Yeah, absolutely. That is what we heard as well. And one of the most frustrating parts of this is that there tends to be a perception from those more rural counties that there's a lot of fear out there. There's also a lot of sort of hidden optimism among people who are actually farming, who want to get into this. I mean, I saw this out here in Washington State, where, I attended some of the early city council meetings and county council meetings where farmers would come before the council and say, hey, listen, I know you have a lot of fear around marijuana, around cannabis, but for me, look, this is a crop that actually could help us make money. I mean, this is a cash crop, and those don't come around very often. Don't sell us out of the market even before we have a chance to opt in. And so that was why you saw, that was the fear that drove a lot of these rural areas to kind of come out preemptively and say, yeah, I think we're probably going to opt out, even if New York legalizes. And it's still, as you say, even if you're a Democratic legislator, it is still a tough vote to post if you're of a certain generation and you grew up in Just Say No, and you went through the DARE program and all of that. It still takes a bit of a leap of faith to make a yes vote in favor of legalization, even though it's already happening in 10 other states, and
look,
hasn't fallen.
Here's the problem. I think New York does not have a ballot initiative. It can never be the will of the people. It's always going to be a legislative dictate. And Albany is notoriously, what's the word we should use? Let's just use inept at sort of forging new ground. I mean, this year they did a great job. They passed a lot of things. But this is a big possible revenue earner for a state that's not in the best shape, and it's very difficult to do this stuff without knowing the will of the people is behind you, I think.
Yeah, one of the things that we found most interesting back here, like looking at it across the country from the West Coast, is that we were perplexed initially about why New York would try to pass legalization as part of its budget process. And slowly it dawned on us, just talking with people in Albany, they were saying, look, here's the deal. If you pass it as part of the budget package, when you're laying down a vote, you're laying down a vote for or against the entire state budget, as opposed to when you're voting for, a singular solo bill that deals with marijuana legalization. You're going on the record in favor of the weed, right? In the eyes of your coming opponent next election. And that, the penny dropped for a lot of us then. It was like, oh, right, of course. It's not about really what you think is right or wrong. It's what you think is going to be used against you in the next primary election. Or general election. Right.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. The final point that my friend up in Albany said is that, Andrew Cuomo is not a natural ally of cannabis. If it was, as you mentioned, if it wasn't for Cynthia Nixon, we all thought he probably wouldn't have gone there. And he's probably happy to let it go for now. I don't know if your reporting had any insight into that.
Oh, absolutely. This is the classic John Hickenlooper stance. Hickenlooper was the governor of Colorado when the people of Colorado passed it. He was against it very famously. To his credit, he worked in good faith and allowed it to go through and put in a good system of regulation. But we're seeing this literally, another example of this literally this week with Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, who last year, when she was pressed in the primary by a more progressive opponent, essentially she came out and said she was supporting the States Act, which is a federal way of kind of legalizing, right? We all know that. Now, when the States Act has been reintroduced this very week in 2019, guess whose name is not on the list of co-sponsors? That's right, Senator Dianne Feinstein. Yeah. She is a drug warrior from way, way back.
She's been around too long, I'm afraid. This is the problem with people who will not give up power.
Yeah, and Cuomo is of that generation. I think of Cuomo as a person who is of the Clinton generation, where really their roots are not in legalization. Their roots are in the crime bill of 1994, this sort of thing.
We are the same age. We grew up in the same world, Andrew and I, although he went to private schools, undoubtedly, and I went to public schools. It was not all that repressive. Everybody smoked weed. Everybody. It was as common as candy. So it's a little baffling to me as to how he could be that against it. I think Andrew is probably a political animal, and he just didn't see the benefit, really. Or, or as you said, he was going to take too much heat for it happening. Although I don't
and I'm assuming the
understand
benefit either locally in New York or nationally if he has national aspirations. I mean, who doesn't? Have you announced?
And who doesn't? Yeah, I'm running tomorrow. Vote for me, please.
Right.
Send me money. No, I'm going to support Pete right now. I think Pete, whose last name I will never be able to pronounce, is going to do a better job than me. Plus, he speaks 7 languages and has a bestseller. So I'm voting for Pete.
Yeah.
Anything else on this thought, Bruce? I mean, it's very interesting. New Jersey and New York just failed.
Yeah,
completely blew it.
A couple things that come to mind here. One is that you really have things happening in discrete pockets around the country that that advocates in New York are very aware of. In other words, social equity policies out in California are really stumbling and not quite failing yet, but they're looking very lean and weak at the moment.
Definitely, without a doubt.
And the advocates in New York State saw that, and in a way that I think that made them double down and say, look, we are not allowing this to move forward without social equity requirements that actually have teeth. Because once this law passes, you all are just going to forget about it, and you're going to give them a budget of 49 cents and tell them to go away.
Yeah.
The other thing is that a lot of the advocates still are out there, and they are working for nonprofits, on very, very small budgets. And the cannabis industry is either not supporting them with actual cash, or, if they are, they're doing it very quietly. I've talked to advocates in different states who are wondering, well, look, if you all are raising hundreds of millions of dollars in these rounds of funding, we're doing the groundwork for you, opening these markets state by state. Where's the connection here? Where's a little love for us? And I think I don't have an answer for them. I think they're right. And it is tough to see them doing the hard work out there without any benefit of dollars from cannabis companies, who often will hire their own advocates. They'll hire their own lobbyists and don't see the need to work with folks from NORML or Marijuana Policy Project or Drug Policy Alliance, this sort of thing. I'm like, okay, you can try that tactic. I don't know if it's going to work for you.
Yeah, it's a very short window on history, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think they're not paying attention to the people who paved the way and opened the doors. I think that's absolutely right. Hey, I want to thank you for joining us today. It was very insightful. We love Leafly. I'm very glad that you did this piece. I thought it was great. And keep going.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it, man.
All the best.
All right, you too.
As I previously mentioned, our guest this week is Kris Krane. Kris founded Forefront Advisors in 2011, and he now serves as the president of Forefront, the company. Prior to forming Forefront, he was the director of client services for Cannabis, which was a pioneer in developing best practices within the medical cannabis industry. He has dedicated his career to reforming the nation's misguided drug policies. He was an associate director at NORML from 2000 to 2005 and an executive director of a great organization called Students for a Sensible Drug Policy from 2006 to 2009. That is another great organization you should all know about. He currently serves on the National Cannabis Industry Association Board of Directors and pens a column about the cannabis industry for Forbes. His company, Forefront Holdings, is a leading retail company in the U.S. cannabis sector. It has developed a national platform that consists of multi-state operations and it really includes the Mission branded chain of dispensaries. You should all know about Mission. They're great. It's led by a group of professionals with experience in finance, real estate, manufacturing, and multi-location retail and hospitality. It has invested heavily in assembling a team with management skills and hands-on operating expertise. So with no further ado, I want to introduce you to Kris Krane and this incredibly transparent and forthright conversation about what it's like to be operating in the wild, big world of capitalism today. Kris, thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Likewise. Thanks for having me back.
Fellow podcaster. What is your
fellow
podcast?
Podcaster, yeah.
So you're a fellow podcaster. What is your show about? It's called Marijuana Today, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So I'm a regular guest and occasional host of the Marijuana Today podcast. We've been doing it for about 4 years now. It's a weekly show where we have basically a roundtable discussion group. We have about 8 or 9 regulars that cycle in about 2 or 3 each week, and we discuss the biggest news over the past week in marijuana industry and politics.
And it's sort of like, you call it like a Meet the Press sort of show?
Yeah, if you could think about like exactly the roundtable section of Meet the Press or like a McLaughlin group. So it's basically a host with 2 to 3 guests, but the same people that come on each week. So we've got about 8 or so we call regulars that cycle in and out depending on what the pertinent stories are of the week. But so our listeners really get to know the guests on the show. So we don't do interviews, we don't bring on new people. We really want our listeners to feel like they know the folks and they understand where we come from, and it becomes very familiar. We've been doing this, like I said, for about 4 years with basically the same cast of characters.
So one of the themes I want to talk about in this podcast is surprise. And let me ask you, what do you think is going to be the most surprising thing about the politics of cannabis, maybe in 2019?
Boy, that's a tough question.
Thank you. I like to pose tough questions.
It is a very tough question.
Make it up, Kris.
I'll venture to say I think we're going to see some kind of real reform at the federal level, if not in 2019, I think by 2020 or sometime in 2020. But I think there's a real chance that we see some sort of real reform pass in 2019, which would be a watershed moment. We haven't seen any real reform pass at the federal level basically ever, other than negative negative reform.
Exactly. No, exactly.
And I think we're at the point now where we might see something real pass. And the question is, what does that look like, right? It could be anything from just banking reform, and I think there's a real chance we get banking reform done this year, all the way up to something as monumental as like the States Act, where the federal government would basically recognize the legality of businesses that are operating legally within these legal states, or something in between. I could see sort of anything in between, but I think the momentum is there. I think the Democratic-controlled House is ready to get something passed, whether it's as a standalone or more likely as a piece of a much larger spending bill. And I think the administration, if I had to make one prediction that might surprise people, is that I think that President Trump and the administration are likely to come out in favor of some kind of meaningful cannabis policy reform. If not in 2020, then I think if not in 2019, then probably in early 2020, because I think they know that they need to be on the right side of this issue going into the 2020 election.
I mean, it would be shocking if they didn't, considering it's the only one topic that blue and red America agree upon. But I'm actually secretly, as an unabashed progressive and liberal, I'm secretly hoping he doesn't figure that out, because I don't want him to be President Pot. I don't think he should own this. He doesn't deserve it, as far as I'm concerned.
It would be a very weird thing. I mean, for those of us that have been working on this, like myself, I've been working on this from the policy side for 20-something years. I'm personally not a fan of our current president, but so it'd be very weird if this particular president is the one that ends up being the champion for something that I've worked for so long. But look, I've been at this for long enough to know that you take the support where you can get it, and I think the politics are there, and I think the administration and the president already know it. So I would actually be surprised if we don't see some sort of support for reform before the 2020 election, because if you look at it, he's going to be running again, assuming that he's running, right? And we've got the Michael Cohen hearings on in the background as we talk. Assuming that he's running, he's going to be running against an opponent that is pro-legalization, right, in one form or another. He's going to have to win votes in swing states where this is particularly popular. There's likely going to be legalization initiatives on the ballot in states like Arizona, Ohio, and maybe even Florida. Massive swing states where people will be turning out out to vote for marijuana. And if one candidate is pro-cannabis and another is anti, those people that are turning out to vote because of cannabis and not because of the presidential election are going to vote for the pro-cannabis presidential candidate.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
I think he can't afford to be on the wrong side of this issue.
I think Hillary Clinton, Earl Blumenauer, when we spoke to him, Congressman of Oregon, basically said to us a couple of years ago, if Hillary Clinton had been on the right side of the issue, she might have won. All the polls suggested very strongly that she would have won some of those Midwestern states that she lost by just a tiny margin.
She might have. That's right. I think this was a massive missed opportunity for Hillary Clinton and for the Democrats in general.
Definitely.
I write a column for Forbes, and I did a column on this last year about why President Trump can and should own this issue and why the Democrats blew it, right? And the Democrats had every chance to own this issue throughout, certainly the 8 years of the Obama administration. They had their best opportunity to own this issue during the 2016 election. And if Hillary Clinton had the political courage to do it, A, she might be president now, and B, this would be an issue that Democrats would be benefiting from politically for the foreseeable future. And yet now, because they didn't do that, the ball is entirely in Trump's court. He has the bully pulpit, and if he decides to own this issue, it doesn't matter if all the Democrats that he's running against are in favor of it. Like he's going to
own the issue. There's just no doubt about it. Let's pivot a little. You talked about your past as sort of an activist. So you worked at Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Did you also work at American for Safe Access?
No, I worked at NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, for about 6 years after college, right after college. And then I was the executive director at Students for Sensible Drug Policy for 4 years in the late 2000s, basically 2006 through 2009. And my activism actually goes back even to when I was a college student. I was involved with both of those same organizations. I was involved with the NORML chapter at American University as an undergrad, which then turned into one of the inaugural chapters of Students for Sensible Drug Policy when we started that organization back in 1998.
I love those guys. I think they're great. I think it's a great organization. But I want to ask you this. Okay, so you're now the CEO of Forefront. You have
president.
Forgive me. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I stand corrected.
He gets to do all the hard work. I get to do the fun stuff.
Okay, President Krane. Let me call you President Krane for the rest of this interview. Here's what I want to know, though. I mean, I've spoken to the heads of lots of these multi-state operators, and there's an interesting problem that comes up is a lot of them don't want to talk about their own personal use of cannabis. And I don't know if you do this or not. I'm actually quite naive about if you do it. Do you talk about your own personal use?
I have no problem talking about my personal use of cannabis.
So how is that not a huge contradiction? How does one really reconcile the fact that some people say, I don't want to talk about it, it's going to upset my board, or, I'm the president of a company or the CEO of a company, whatever title you so desire, I can't talk about my personal use. What do you think about that?
I don't understand it. I mean, I guess the thinking is it's still federally illegal and they don't want to admit to committing a federal crime, but like their whole business is a federal crime.
Yes, exactly.
So, if we're gonna, you're gonna violate the Controlled Substances Act by, growing copious amounts of cannabis and producing copious amounts of cannabis. I mean, the reality is, for most of these multi-state operators, if the federal government wanted to go after them and apply the full force of the law, I mean, we could all be facing the death penalty. Like, the death penalty is still on the books in federal law for massive, for cultivation of massive quantities of cannabis. And most of these multi-state operators, when you combine their cultivation output and sales output, right, could technically qualify for the death penalty under federal law. Right now, I mean, it's we say this tongue in cheek, right? Like, this doesn't actually happen. I don't think the federal government has ever actually brought a death penalty case again for marijuana.
No, period. But it obviously it points out the hypocrisy, or I don't know if hypocrisy is quite the word, but the contradiction of it's federally illegal, therefore I'm not saying it. But I think that's a cover. I think it is a cover for. I actually think it's being in the closet, to tell you the truth. I find it. I think there's some truth.
No, I think there's some truth to that.
I find it a little shameful. Okay,
there's still a taboo out there about cannabis use, and I think some of these folks are trying to appeal to an investor base that is just in it for the money, but doesn't really understand cannabis, and may still have that that prohibitionist stereotype in their head that if somebody uses cannabis, then they must be a loser or a low performer or whatever it is. And I want my CEO to be to be cannabis free. I don't think that there's many that actually believe that, but I think that's what I think that's what the thinking is there.
it's still an artifact, isn't it? It's still quite there.
It's a remnant of prohibition, and there's something that I like to do when I give talks, particularly in states that have like just legalized or just legalized for medical purposes, is when I'm talking, and I'll talk about like new technologies, or I'll talk about the rise of vape pens and how the legal industry is changing cannabis consumption, and I'll like to, depending on where I am, I like to pull out some cannabis or pull out a vape pen and just show it to the audience. And what you typically get in these newer areas is people that kind of snicker and giggle about it, even though they're there because they're interested in getting involved in the industry. And like, I want to get beyond the giggles and the snickers. And you do that, I think, just by exposing people to it. So like, look, there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing weird about me holding cannabis. You should get used to seeing this if you want to be in the business and not think it's something, silly or juvenile.
No, I do the same thing. I actually like to bring a show and tell thing. I show them breath strips and explain that, a tincture can now be made as a breath strip. Look at how discreet it is. It fits in your pocket. Look at how easy it is to cut up. And I love watching the response to that, actually. I think it's really, really interesting to show new I love show and tell, actually. I think it's a great thing.
It's a lot of fun.
And I think it does sort of ease it up, doesn't it? It just normalizes it instantly, right?
It does, because because then the next time they see it or the third time they see it, it's just normal, right? They're not going to have those giggles, right? They're not going to think about it as anything sort of taboo. But even though it's legal, and even for people that support it, you still need to get past the taboo that's just been drilled into them through decades of prohibition.
I mean, I have another final. We can end this conversation now. But the final thought I have on this is, if you run a wine company, a champagne company, a spirits company, a beer company, you drink the damn stuff. And you better drink the stuff because you better know what's good and what's bad, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, no one would ever. You're expected to, right? Even if you. I mean, yeah, you better do that. I wouldn't trust you if you said I'm a teetotaler, but I run this wine company. I've never tasted this stuff.
Right. It would be bizarre. I mean, you're kind of expecting. You sit down with if you run a wine company or a liquor company, and you're sitting down with a group of investors, like they're going to expect you to break out the wine or the liquor and share with them and show them what it is that you produce. And like, I don't think this should be any different.
Good. I'm glad we're on the same side of that one. Now, let's continue on the subject of surprise. What has been the most surprising thing about going from an activist and then to a guy who, had a consulting company and compliance and getting people up to speed, and now you're running a company in this industry? It doesn't have to be the most positive surprising thing. It could be, actually, give me a surprising thing positive and a surprising thing negative in your experience. And just speak personally, please.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, positively, having come from the movement, right, the advocacy movement, I think one of the most positive things, and I don't know if it's necessarily surprising, although in some cases it has been, is how many people that get into this industry for financial reasons, right, because they see it as a financial opportunity, wind up becoming genuine advocates for the cause, right? Like once they're exposed to cannabis and they're exposed to, particularly to patients, they really start to realize how important this issue is, that it's more than just about the money that they can make as a cannabis entrepreneur, but that this fits into a bigger sort of a bigger framework of civil rights and social justice and personal liberty and personal freedom, right? And whether they're coming at it from sort of the right or the left, right? This fits into a bigger narrative, and I've seen a lot of folks who get in this because they just see it as a business opportunity, and once they're in it, they really become big advocates for the cause. That has been really heartening. Let's
talk about the negative. What have you learned surprising that has been a bit disheartening to you?
I guess having spent a lot of time as a sort of professional activist, professional advocate, I never really encountered the kind of greed that you see from some folks in this industry.
You're not the first person to say that, obviously. You don't have to name any names, obviously, but give me a few examples of what you mean by greed, other than the craven lust for dollars.
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple of examples, and I will not name names here, but on the second one, I'll sort of will. But
good, even better.
I've seen some examples of people who have come into this industry with with serious business background, largely Wall Street background. I've kind of gotten to the point where if somebody has a Goldman Sachs background, I'm like especially wary. But who have basically used. I don't know if trickery is the right word, but sort of used their experience and their knowledge.
How about thievery? How about lying thievery? Are those good words?
Yeah, I know exactly. I mean, to basically steal companies from people. Like I've seen instances where folks have come in and say that they're gonna fund a mom and pop operator and then through some really devious schemes, find ways to basically, kick out the people that did all the work to get the license and, don't give them any, compensation for the work that they've done. I've seen, and I won't name any names here, but I've seen a situation where, investors have come in and put together an operating agreement, which is, amazingly one-sided in their favor, that the folks that they were partnering with didn't have the sophistication to understand what they were signing, and then will basically in one case, called the police on their partners over, sort of a made up charge, and then used a clause in the operating agreement that if somebody's the subject of a criminal investigation, that's cause to remove them from the company. Things along, things like that, where people who have the means and the knowledge are able to basically steal from people who thought that they were doing something that would be a good opportunity for them and their family. That kind of stuff is just really disheartening.
You're telling me. Tell me another example. I'm loving this. Go on.
Sure. Well, I think there are certain parts of the industry where my advocacy and my industry hats may conflict a little bit. And I think the best example of this is supporting home grow. And this is a debate that comes up in all these new states: is should we allow people to grow their own at home? And I mean, the example I would give is just last week, the trade association in New York State, I think it's called the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association, NYMCIA, I think, put together a policy position paper saying that when New York legalizes, that people should not be allowed to grow at home, and they raise the specter of home invasions and public safety concerns. None of which have actually played out in the states where home grow is legal. It was simply to protect their own bottom line, make sure that everybody who uses cannabis in the state of New York
cannabis has to buy it. Yeah, that they have to buy it.
In particular, in a state like New York, where there's only 10 operators in the entire state. Now, to their credit, that not all 10 of those were signatories to that letter, but the majority were. And I think that's a morally indefensible position for somebody to be taking, that, they can make millions of dollars selling, growing, producing, and selling cannabis, but others should face fines or arrests or any kind of penalty whatsoever for doing the same thing in the comfort of their own home for themselves and their friends.
It's a blatant disgrace. What's your company position on that?
We are in favor of home grow. Like unequivocal, we think people should be allowed to grow their own at home.
And are you in favor of making it only 3 plants, 12 plants? Do you put a number on it? How do you define it?
I don't put a number on it. I do understand from a policy perspective, putting some sort of reasonable limit. We do the same thing with home brewing, right? You can't set up an industrial home brew in your basement. It has to be for personal use. And so putting, whether it's a plant number or a canopy square footage limit, there's something along those lines. I do think that's reasonable. Because, otherwise you can wind up in a situation where somebody is basically running a business out of their garage or out of their basement, that's unlicensed. And yes, there's concerns that,
and no quality control, of course.
And that is a real concern. But if somebody's growing for themselves and they're sharing with a couple of friends of theirs, who cares? Right? We don't say you can't do that for beer. We don't say you can't do that for wine, or you can't have your own little home distillery if you were to want to. Why would we say the same thing for cannabis? And I think, frankly, you're pissing off your customer base by taking that position. Because the reality is, if you think about home brewing, somebody who brews beer in their basement because it's their hobby and they enjoy doing it, that person buys a lot of beer, right? They're not,
Absolutely.
they're not going out and
absolutely.
they're not going out and like not going to the liquor store, not going to the convenience store and buying beer because they've got some crappy IPA that they brew in their basement, right? Like they're doing that for fun and to supplement their beer drinking, but they still want to buy all the other kinds of beer that are out there. And same thing with a home grower, right? The people who grow at home by and large are cannabis enthusiasts. The cannabis that they grow at home is probably not going to be the only cannabis that they consume. They're not going to be able to create vape pen cartridges in their basements. They're not going to be able to create all sorts of edibles and the dissolving strips that you talked about and topicals and all the other products that they will enjoy getting in a dispensary. So yeah, maybe they'll buy a little bit less flower, but they're still buying a lot of product. And I think as a cannabis company, you're shooting yourself in the foot by taking a policy position that's going to outrage the same people that are likely to be your biggest customers.
I mean, what's amazing is about all these home cooks is it reminds me of my Italian grandmother who, would make the marinara all day and then stand over you and watch you eat it. And if you didn't smile and smack your lips and express great satisfaction, she was not a happy person, right? So I think a lot of the edible people...
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Folks. There's folks that just love it, and even on the cultivation side. I mean, there are people, friends who they just love growing cannabis, and that's really all they want to do. And I will say, a lot of those folks are not really cut out to cultivate on an industrial scale.
They love growing,
but they love growing. Yeah, they love growing, and like, why would they want to deny somebody
from
that?
all walks of life who fit that profile, from plant people to
Absolutely.
Industrialists to former tech people. They love to grow the plant, and how can you can't deny them that? It's a plant, for God's sakes. It's only going to be grown anyway. No one's going to abide by that law. It's a stupid law. Talk about you're an entrepreneur, obviously, with an ethical backbone and an ethical foundation here, for better or for worse, by the way. What's your company's take on equity and give back? Is it more than just putting planters on the street in front of the dispensary? And if not, why?
Oh, I think it is. So, we made a sizable donation to Students for Sensible Drug Policy at the end of last year as a matching grant to help encourage others to do the same. We like to support organizations that have done that have done and are doing the very important work to end prohibition, because without that work, we wouldn't be here. None of this business opportunity would exist. So I think it's imperative that cannabis companies give back to, particularly to the organizations that do this important work. Because again, we wouldn't be here. Right? We're all here because of the work that Students for Sensible Drug Policy and NORML and the Marijuana Policy Project and Drug Policy Alliance or Americans for Safe Access, all these groups have been doing for decades to actually change the laws that allow these markets to thrive. And if we come in and just take advantage of that and just make money in these markets without giving back and supporting the advocates that got us here and that are going to take us to the next level, right? We still got to legalize in more states. We still got to end federal prohibition. Then I think we're, I just think that's a morally indefensible position. I think organizations need to do more to give back. And then at the community level, it's the same kind of thing. We need to be involved in our communities beyond just operating a shop. So it means being members of the Chamber of Commerce. It means going to local fairs and farmers markets and being out there and giving back and just being available for conversation. And I bring this back to, my motivation for getting involved in the industry in the first place, which was, I saw places like Harborside Health Center and Berkeley Patients Group and some of these early pioneering Northern California dispensaries, and just how well run and community focused they were. And it really dawned on me early on that virtually nobody can interact with a place like a Harborside or a BPG and think that this is something that should be illegal.
Yeah.
Right? That it changes the stereotype, right? It changes the stereotype that people have of what cannabis distribution looks like, from the street corner deal or the burnouts in the parents' basement, the stuff that's been sort of drilled into us since we were quite young, to a beautiful, well-run professional retail store that's engaged with the community, that even if you're not a consumer, you're not a patient, you're not going to be ashamed to have that in your community, and you're probably going to think that it does, it's a net positive, and that that in and of itself, right, operating these businesses professionally and working with your communities plays a very significant role in helping to ultimately end marijuana prohibition by changing public opinion.
I think it's I remember the first time I walked into Harborside, for example, and I was absolutely blown away by the level of real care that I got. And it was exceptional because actually there, and we can talk about this at any time, the level of understanding and education in the bud tenders was extremely high and very impressive. And I thought very impressive.
Exactly.
Exactly. So what do you, today, obviously, this market is growing very quickly and all sorts of people are coming into cannabis. And this is a hard question, I know, but what's the most surprising thing about today's user? I'm on the level of surprise again, the question of surprise, that has struck you.
I think it's the emergence of all these new products that are allowing new people to experience cannabis, right? I mean, we live in a culture now where smoking in general, right, not just cannabis, but smoking by and large, has become much more taboo. And in the illicit market, really all that's available are smokable products, right? It's essentially the raw materials. But once you have a regulated market, you can create all kinds of new devices and new products and new form factors. And I think that has, led to a new generation and a new type of cannabis consumer that you wouldn't have had in the black market. In particular, the most of the newer adopters are people in their 30s and 40s, right? It's not the 20-somethings. And these are folks that generally are not looking to smoke. By and large, they're looking for low-dose products or lower-dose products, right? They're not looking to eat a 50-milligram edible. They're probably looking to eat a 2.5-milligram edible or
me.
5-milligram edible.
That's me.
Right. That's most consumers, right? And yeah, I think that's most of us. And the emergence of things like vape pens and just I've been surprised at how fast the market has adopted vape pens and vape pen cartridges. I mean, you see in a lot of places now, vape pen cartridges alone outsell flower in a lot of stores. And once people are exposed to that, they tend to stay there. One thing that was surprising to me, we have a store in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's one of our better performing stores. And when we opened there, the law did not allow for the sale of smokable product. And so, we opened with vape pens and cartridges and other kinds of topicals and tinctures and so forth. They didn't even allow edibles, other than I think a lozenge. And so, vape pen cartridges were by far our biggest seller. And then a couple months in, they changed the regulations to allow for the sale of flower. Technically, they allow for non-smokable flower. So you can
what is that?
Figure out what that means.
I have a question mark above my head. You mean a vapor cartridge?
No. You can sell the flower itself. You just have to sell it with a warning saying it's for vaporization purposes only. You're not to smoke this.
That's a great regulation and a great law. It makes so much sense. Who do you think wrote that one?
It was actually the state of Ohio. So Ohio and Pennsylvania passed their laws around the same time. Both of them had provisions that allowed no smokable products. And Ohio decided, well, we can allow non-smokable flower. So basically, no pre-rolls, and you have to have. It's like the old head shops where you'd say, this water pipe is for tobacco purposes only, right? And what people do when they leave the store, you don't know. And so Pennsylvania and Ohio have adopted the same thing for non-smokable cannabis, non-smokable flower. But what was surprising to me was when we were able to introduce flower to the market in that Allentown store, I expected that it would very quickly become our best seller, as it is most places, and it didn't. We're now something like 6 months or 4 to 6 months or so after that change was allowed, and vape pen cartridges still outsell flower.
Interesting.
So what that tells me is that once the market is introduced to alternative methods of ingestion,
they like it.
They tend to like them, and they tend to stay there.
Yeah, they're easy.
Yeah, that's right.
They're just easy. Not everybody wants to carry around a grinder. I will always be a flower lover,
right.
But I totally get why not everybody is. It makes complete sense to me.
Yes, and I'm the same. I prefer flower myself. I like my vape pen cartridges also. They're great for travel, and I can see where an older crowd, not an older crowd, right, but just a more adult crowd, right, the 30s, 40s, 50s, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people with kids, right, often don't want to smell like cannabis. People who when they leave work, right, they don't want to like walk outside their office building and light a joint, but they can pull out their vape pen and nobody's the wiser for it. So it's more discreet, it's less taboo, it doesn't leave the smell, and so it makes perfect sense why this is becoming more popular. I've just been surprised at how fast the market has adopted the use of this type of product compared to
let's come on. They've been deprived of stuff for a very long time. It seems like the hunger has been rising, and now it's able to be satisfied. Sure,
but it's not for but not for cannabis in general. I'm not surprised, but
these new products,
new products, right? I would have thought that more people would come into the market and just use flower because that's what people have been used to for so long, and that's not really the case. We're seeing a very quick migration to other forms of administration.
So I was having this conversation the other day, and it didn't get to a level of satisfaction. Maybe you can add some insight into it. My friend was saying, the thing about cannabis is it makes people happy. And I said, that's not it. Because happy is, happy, I don't understand happy. It's sort of, it's not a steady state. It's, how do we define it? Is it really what makes people happy? And I started thinking about it, and I was thinking it's really not a feeling of happy. It might just be a feeling of satisfied with what's in front of you. How do you define the feelings or the why of why people like cannabis? I'm not talking about the medical side here. I'm just talking about the general user, why one would use it, perhaps in place of a drink. Okay, how do you talk about that, or how do you think about that?
So I think for a lot of people it does make them happy, but I really still look at it through a wellness lens or wellness framework. I think most people that are using cannabis are using it for some sort of wellness benefit, whether they would categorize it that way or not. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, people use it because they're stressed out at work and they come home at the end of the day and they want to unwind, right? And they may not want to use alcohol, which, I mean, in many cases, alcohol is going to exacerbate people's stress or make them more angry, right? I mean, I think cannabis is really good at helping people de-stress at the end of the day. It helps some people become better parents, right? If somebody comes home from work and they're super stressed out and they can't let go, they can't let go of the office, and it can make them that can make it harder for them to get down to a kid's level and just let all that go and enjoy being in the moment. And I think cannabis helps people enjoy being in the moment, and let some of that other stuff go. So obviously there are people that are using it for very legitimate medical benefits.
Of course. Oh yeah.
They've been very legit, right? All the way from people who are using it to help treat their cancer or their chemotherapy, all the way to people using it to glaucoma or other, not quite as not like fatal type diseases, but still important. And so I think most people who are using it are getting some sort of wellness benefit out of it, whether they like it or not. And I think that is inherently a positive for folks. I think the plant is a net positive for society. It enhances music. It can enhance lots of things that we do with our days. And I think I think people see that as a good thing, and it doesn't have the negative impacts that we see with alcohol, right? It doesn't make people violent. You don't see instances of spousal abuse go up with cannabis use. In fact, it probably go down, compared with alcohol. It certainly doesn't have the hangover. So people want to, especially I think as people get older, right? We don't handle alcohol as well as we did when we were in our 20s.
So interesting. Absolutely not.
Yeah. So, so when people go out in the evenings, rather than have 4 or 5 drinks and feel like crap the next day, they can maybe they'll have one drink and they'll have their vape pen and they'll share that with their friends and they'll feel fine the next day. I've seen a lot of that movement amongst I'm 40 years old, and amongst sort of my cohort and my colleagues' cohorts who are all in the same age, I'm seeing a lot of them shift from alcohol to marijuana because they like the way it makes them feel and it doesn't have all the negative side effects that they get with alcohol.
Yeah, totally agree. So final surprise question is, and I'll share first. I mean, one of the most surprising things about the plant is how my own body has changed in response to it. As I've grown older, I have a much higher sensitivity. right? Just as you said with alcohol. But I find that I need much less cannabis. And it's not about the strength of the plant. It's just about what I'm interested in, what I tolerate. So I found that very surprising. And there's not much research on how your body, how the receptor system, how the receptor system changes in terms of age. So I'm always sort of in shock by that. What's the most surprising thing you've learned about the plant in your years of use or being around it?
That's a tough one.
I like to ask hard questions. I don't like to ask the easy ones. I mean, I want to hear your insight there.
The most surprising thing for me personally about the plant, I just think by and large it's been a real positive in my life in a lot of different ways. And we're taught.
Name two. Tell me two.
My health. Right. I do use it for medical benefits. And it's been, it's been something that's allowed me to stay off of, would be much, sort of heavier pharmaceuticals. I don't take any real prescription drugs. And cannabis has been, really helpful in helping me manage my own symptoms. And in low doses, right? I mean, it's not like I need to get the psychoactivity of it when I use it. If I have to use during the day for medical reasons, it's just a very small amount is found to be incredibly helpful and really helps bring me to a place of balance. Where I talk about this sometimes. I mean, I have a condition called trichotillomania, which is very similar to Tourette's, but it doesn't manifest with any kind of verbal tics. It's tics with your hands and picking and stuff that I went through therapy for years when I was younger, and I've dealt with since I was a little kid. And it's much like Tourette's patients will describe a sort of a buildup of energy that can only be released by sort of blurting something out. Trichotillomania patients describe the same buildup of energy that gets released usually through some kind of like skin or hair picking, or other kind of a mobile tic. And I find a very small amount of cannabis, one or two pulls off of a vape pen, will just sort of help bring the body back to balance, and decrease that excess energy that needs to get out somehow. And that, that runs very counter to what we've been told about cannabis from, when we're quite young, about what it can do for you. And then, and I found it to be very helpful in sort of balance in life in general. I'm a fairly high functioning person running a company. I work really crazy hours a lot of the time, and I need to be able to turn that off. I need to be able to be present for my wife, for my children, for my family. And I found cannabis to be helpful, and generally in that case, in larger doses, to just help me be more present and be more in the moment.
I really appreciate your honesty. You're the rare CEO who will actually reveal. And
absolutely. Still not a CEO.
Kris Krane. But I'm so sorry. You are the President Krane. I promised I would call you that. God damn it. But listen, thanks so much for joining me. I look forward to talking again.
Absolutely. Anytime. I really enjoy this, and thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome, President.
If you would like to be the first to know what Brave New Weed is up to, you can join our mailing list. Visit bravenewweed.com and sign up today.
Thanks again, Kris. It's always great to hear people who are in the world of big money able to step back and have a look at what it all means and how you're going to use some of that money for the common good. I really always appreciate that. Again, I want to thank our sponsor, Atlas Growers, which is soon to be the largest producer of medical cannabis in Canada, for enabling us to do this show and keep the lights on. I want to remind you that they are growing incredible flower in a state-of-the-art facility, and that they are really committed to creating great product in Canada. So keep your eye on Atlas Growers, folks. I also want to thank Medical Cannabis Mentor, which is a company that I founded, which is dedicated to bringing medical cannabis education to healthcare providers, dispensary workers, and patients for supporting this show. Yes, I am double dipping here, folks, but Medical Cannabis Mentor has great coursework. And if you or your dispensary, or if you're a nurse or a doctor and you want to get up to speed on evidence-based medical cannabis education, I really hope you'll check us out. It's medicalcannabismentor.com. And finally, I want to tell you that next week, our next episode, is going to be all about CBD. We're featuring Martin Lee, who's the founder of Project CBD, which began talking about CBD way back when, before anybody knew what it was, these 3 letters. Most people thought it was a television network. And he is going to provide his insight into really what CBD is, how not to get ripped off, why it's so damn expensive, and what it isn't. So definitely tune into that one.
Really, really excited for this episode. One of the most common things that has come across my email inbox, across my social media, has been, as we have gone deeper and deeper into this podcast, people who want to ask me questions about CBD. So I'm very, very excited that we can bring this finally to all of you. And hopefully we can dispel some of this. There's a lot going on right now in the world of CBD. It's legal. It's still kind of the Wild West. The FDA is doing some cracking down. We're going to get into a lot of that stuff on the next episode. But I just want to say, I think it's going to be a great one. I think it's going to be super insightful to anyone who wants a clear explanation of how to enter into the world of CBD.
Let me leave you with this idea. There are now more Google searches for CBD than God.
Jeez. There you go.
Thanks for listening in, folks.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.